If you're visiting tonight, there are outlines on this communion table, and there's some on this one. And tonight will be our last class in this quarter, and Lord willing, next Tuesday night, before Thanksgiving, we'll meet for a devotional. But there are a few outlines from older lessons that are still over on that one that you're welcome to take if you want to. For those of you who are in class, don't think that I handed out 8 pages tonight. These are for the Bereans to be able to look at later. One of the joys and blessings of our life was that after we finished Oklahoma Christian, we got to go to Memphis, and Harding had a campus in Memphis, and we're there for 3 years. And I love the classes on preaching and missions taught by Philip Slate. But my 2 favorite textual classes were the religious teachings of the Old Testament and a class on the book of Psalms. And anyone else need an outline? We've got a volunteer to get them to us. It'll help you tonight if you get one. And in my class on Psalms, we always had to do roughly a 15, 20-page research paper. And my paper was on the nature Psalms. And I laugh because at a later time, I'm in a congregation and our teacher went through the book of Psalms and he rated them in terms of spirituality. And so the Psalms that had to do with the coming of the Messiah and everything got a high mark. He did not like the seas clap their hands and the trees sing for joy Psalms. And he gave them a 3 or a 4. And I didn't say anything. I just chose not to get involved. But what my goal tonight is to, and this is probably going to become a Monday night. We do occasionally a Monday night at Macquarie. But what I want us to do tonight is to look at specifically some, and let me find the best word to say this. I want us to look at some of the features, is the word I'm looking for. I want us to look at some of the features of Baal worship because God's people are always tempted, and I'm going to maintain probably for the majority of the time, are involved in some type of idol worship. Most of us know how significant the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries were in the 1940s. And the idea that a young Bedouin would throw a rock into a cave and kind of hear the sound of a breaking clay pot and go in, and then here are these manuscripts, some stored from before the time of Jesus in terms of that. And that was just such an amazing discovery. Well, in terms of cultural background, the same thing happened in 1928. So if you do primary around Jerusalem, Samaria, Galilee, go further north up into Syria, a man is plowing one day, and as he plows, he kind of hears this crushing sound, and he got to looking, and this is going to develop into a whole excavation that's going to be over decades. And what was found were original clay tablets that had been obviously put out and dried and stored, and eventually parts of a city and everything else. And when preachers in the area ask for a couple of books, they've made a mistake. Rosh Shamra. So sometimes if you just want to kind of, and I'll leave this up on the front, and this is the name of the city that was found. And what they found for the first time were clay tablets that were describing the intricacies and the processes of Baal worship. It's R-A-S-S-H-A-M-R-A. And Rosh Shamra, and both the discovery, the translation, and these other things, starting from the 20s, and this is going to take several decades, it was like for the first time, rather than only hearing from the Old Testament, which would be their enemies, then we were able to listen from the other side and actually have the descriptions and the religion and the teaching of the people who were the proponents of Baal worship. Now, and I know this is a little bit silly, but it would never happen, but just think about this. And I wouldn't even try this with your grandchildren, but I can remember being about this big, and we went to Elk City, and we were watching films with nuclear bombs going off, and Nikita Khrushchev took his shoe off and beat the pulpit where he's at, and what did he holler? We are going to do what? We are going to bury you. And I guarantee you, if you're about this big, that kind of gets your attention. But can you imagine, and like I said, this is hypothetical, but can you imagine only knowing about Russia from U.S. newspapers and U.S. historians for centuries, and then at a point in time down the road, then you actually get the writings from people in the Kremlin and in the Russian government, and you're able to see from their point of view what you could only have seen before from those who were speaking against them. And so here's going to be the bottom line, and you're going to have to be kind of patient with me tonight. The emotion, the primary emotion of polytheism, many gods, is fear. And while I'm in the religious teachings of the Old Testament, and again, here's a whole class as well, and he just asked an open-ended question, and I didn't nibble because I wanted just to think. And our teacher said, what is the most unique, predominant emotion in the Old Testament that is totally missing in all of the ancient Near Eastern sources around it? And the word is joy. You don't find joy in the Rosh Hashanah tablets. You don't find joy when you read from the Babylonians and these other things. And he said the one thing that was just as far as from the east to the west was the fear factor on this side. And again, we'll have to walk through this a couple of times. If there are many gods, what do you do if you've offended one of them? How do you know which God's in control? And even if you read anything from the Greek writings, there's always this God was helping this one and on and on. And so there was just this constant trepidation about which God is in charge, which God do we worship, which God have we offended. And so you read things like stories from ancient Canaan, God versus Baal, and these other things. And these are descriptions that we finally have in this past century that for the first time we're able to literally read from their sources. Here was their teachings. This was what they taught people, and here were things that were about that. And that's why that just makes this such a wonderful discovery. Like I said, I'll leave these on the front. If you want to peruse any of them or pick them up, then you can do that later. For those who had an outline, I'd like you to turn to page 5. We're just going to highlight a couple of things on these back ones and just show you some things to look at. And I know this sounds like a little bit of a technical term, but this is still what I want us to do. What is the thinking of idolatry? When people are involved in idol worship, it's not just a matter of addition, other gods. There's a whole mindset that takes place. But I just want to remind us of this, and this is under number 1. Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years. And we're not going to try to do anything on the gods, and there are many, many, many gods in Egypt, and they would be like human figures with heads of animals and birds and all this other stuff. But Israel had been in a land, and again, I don't like to use words we don't use a lot, but let me just say polytheism, many gods. Israel had been in a land of many gods for 430 years. Who gets the bright idea of building a golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai? Oh, that's what people did in Egypt. And when you read the 10 Commandments, they are very specifically and the word polemic is a teaching against. The 10 Commandments are a polemic, the first 4 specifically, against idolatry and polytheism, and they continue on with the others, and we'll notice this in just a second. But specifically, no other gods, little g, plural s, no other gods before me, no graven images. And again, here's a whole lesson, but think about this. How unique is the teaching in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, let us make man in our image. And idolatry is when the image of God, which is us, makes a physical image of something else, and therefore spiritually prostitutes the nature of the original image by worshiping something other than God. No other gods before me, no graven images, do not take the Lord's name in vain. Here's the main thing, and this is under number 2 that I want you to see. When you look at the left-hand side, and again, here's the polytheist, here's the people who worship many gods. Mankind is down here on the bottom, and like I said, see, this is so widespread. As I walked through your city, I perceived an altar to the, just in case we have offended somebody, just in case we, see what I'm talking about? There's just this constant, we're not quite sure, we're not quite confident. And even in the city of Athens, hundreds of years later, in a polytheistic society, just in case we missed anybody, the altar to the unknown God. And so here's man, here's the gods, but here's a really key area. The whole idea of polytheism is that the actual, and let's use the word force, and I'm not talking about Star Wars, and I'm not talking about E.T., but I'm talking about the polytheists felt like that there was a heavenly force that was above the different gods, but you used a different god to get to that source. And in the middle is the word magic. And we're not talking about pulling rabbits out of hats. We're talking about the whole idea of incantations. We're talking about, this is going to get gross before we get done. We're talking about snake worship. We're going to be talking about sacred prostitution. And when you come to the worship of Molech, we're going to be talking about sacrificing children. If you carefully read through the Old Testament, there's times that your blood's going to run cold. And here's what's the tragedy of tragedies. We're coming out of Egypt, and what does God tell the Israelites to do? Do not have mercy on them. I want you to wipe out these people, and that sounds really cruel and harsh until you realize that when they didn't, in time, the Israelites are more proficient idolaters and worshipers of many gods than the people were when they first came into the land. They have even perfected the idol worship years later more than the original Canaanites had when they first came into the land, and these were the people of God. And so when you hear these terms, and once again, you start reading, you'll notice this: necromancers, people who call up the dead, people who are involved in magic. And when you hear those things, there's an attempt, either through or even to bypass the gods, to get the attention so that something will actually happen. But these many gods are the means to get there. 3 key ideas, and we're going to turn the page. The gods are in nature. And let me just go ahead and say this here. And I do not want to be misunderstood. I will totally support any parent's choice for what they want to choose to do with their kids' education, okay? This will sound like an anti-Christian education, and it's not, but let me just say it this way. I totally support whatever individual parents want to do. With our kids, growing up in a very secular society, going to a religious school would have been absolute culture shock when they came back. Our son is in a soccer league, 8 teams. They do a survey, and there's one boy, not one team, on 8 teams, there is one boy who has a Sunday morning commitment. We go to the 4th grade interview, and the teacher says, I have 28 kids, and your son is one of the 3 kids who go to church anywhere at any time. And I said, how did you know that? Is it in the records? He said, oh, no. He said, I can tell. He can listen. He treats me with respect. and he's thoughtful to his peers. He's only one of 3 people who know how to do that in my whole class. If you have grown up in a world where every time you open your mouth, you're different because you're a Yankee, and then you come to a Christian school, the culture shock would just be horrible. So we told our kids, we want you to enter in every science class that you can, especially our son, that was kind of his thing. And I said, Matey, I want you to make the A's on the evolution stuff because I can't help you with that without laughing. The idea that we came out of a slide, I said, you don't have anything to be afraid of. By the time our 4 kids graduated, we graduated 15 to 17 kids for 4 years in a row. And it wasn't just them. We had a wonderful youth director and other stuff. But our attitude was, we're going to engage the culture rather than withdraw from it. Now, why did I say that? When you read the book of Acts, Moses is trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Why did God train Moses in a totally pagan and in a totally secular society in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians so that he could write the most powerful polemic against idolatry that's ever been written? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the honor students in the Babylonian universities. And everything from the handwriting on the wall to the descriptions of what's going to come. And then you stop and think about it. A doctor is trained to interview people. So God's going to use Dr. Luke's secular background, Theophilus, insomuch as many have undertaken to write an account of the things that happen among us, it seemed good to me to write to you an orderly account, having spoken to, interviewed the eyewitnesses and the ministers of the word. And one of our gospels and the story of the early church is written by a man who God trained in secular medicine, and he used that. And our dear friend Paul, he had sat at the feet of Gamaliel, doing a Jewish history of the New Testament, and our teacher said, in my mind, I think Gamaliel was the brightest mind in Judaism in the whole first century. And again, we'll do this with your grandkids, kind of go, ding, you know what I'm doing? Ding, and I'm thinking, oh, the brightest mind in Judaism is where God sent Paul, because when he writes a book like Galatians, then he understands Judaism from the inside out. He's just not a spectator. With the gods being in nature, and sorry, I had to shake the chills down, the very first words of inspiration tell us that God is outside of nature. He's not in it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God said, God spoke. And from a point of view of dealing with the polytheism in the world, the very opening section of the scripture lays the groundwork that the one God who is the creator is not one of many in the midst of. He is the one who is totally outside of the things that are there. The word fear, we're going to see this a couple of times, is the predominant emotion. How do you know your God's going to listen? And we'll come back and touch on that. And polytheism is going to appeal to man's base nature. I want you to turn the page. It'll be number 6. It'll be on the back of this. Heads up, this is going to be gross, so just kind of get ready. When they got to reading the Baal tablets, and again, it's a myth, it's a story, but the story basically was the ancient God, his name was El. And remember, we've said in the past that the word El is kind of the root Semitic word for God, and Abraham knew him as El Shaddai. Every time you hear El, Israel, there's something about God. Well, in the Baal mythology, the ancient god was was El, but a younger god came along, and his name is Baal. And look at these characteristics. Baal is the storm god. Baal is the god who rides on the clouds. Baal is the god who brings the rain in the springtime. And I'm just going to use the word fertility. Baal is the god who is the source, and whether you're talking about rain, grass, animals, people, Baal is the giver of life. And so when you look at these gods under number one, Mot is going to be the god who is in the deep. And the deep is the place, again, with this primordial evil and other things. And every year, the god Yam talks to Baal and somehow lures him into the deep. And he then is swallowed up and is captured by the forces of darkness. And this will include the god of Mot. So here's the gross part. His sister, sex partner, and the list goes on, is named Asherah. And stop and think, at Mount Carmel, there are 450 prophets of Baal and nearly that many of the prophets of Asherah, which is going to be the female counterpart. So, and again, it's gross. He's her brother. He is her lover, but she throws this dinner, has this banquet, gets all the gods there, and in the process, and this is going to happen every year, it's a myth, then she jumps up and she's very bloodthirsty and she kills the god Mot, who has captured her brother and her lover. And when he escapes, guess what happens? The thunder and lightning starts, he's escaped, the springtime comes and the rain starts taking place. So here's the seasons in the Baal mythology. Wintertime, everything dies, everything gets cold, and guess what has happened up in the heavens? The God who quickens and who brings life has been swallowed up by these forces, and that's wintertime. Okay, here's the grossest part. There are sacred prostitutes in the temple of Baal and Asherah that worship is for men to go and have relations with these prostitutes to encourage Asherah in the heavens to have the dinner, to have the banquet, so that Baal can be resurrected from the dead. And I'm just going to say it like this. How worldly and how gross is it when sacred prostitution is a part of worship? Do you see what I'm saying from just a fleshly, worldly point of view? And when you start reading, like, for example, the children of Israel very quickly meet people, and you're going to find people having relations with people of those other nations. And a part of why God told them to do that was to eradicate that. And when they didn't, over a period of time, this practice became more prevalent even than the worship of the Lord. So springtime comes, and this happens in the heavens. Baal is released. He rides the clouds. It thunders and lightnings. The springtime comes. The summer comes. And then, I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, but every winter this happens again. And this is a description. And notice this. There is a heavenly description in the ultimate realm for what's taking place on earth. Now, what you're going to see, and again, I'll leave most of this for you to read, the worship of Baal most often took place under green trees, a fertility rite, on the high places, and involved the worship of many gods. And so therefore, anytime you come across high places, green trees, or many gods and the sacrifices, in my mind I hear, dun, 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 dun. Because from the Baal tablets, these are the signature places where the idolatry and the worship's taking place. And this is also indicative that sacred prostitution is going on by the people who are worshiping Baal. Now, just think about something for a second. The kingdom divides in 931. David is king in 1000. He dies. Solomon lives. He's going to die in 931. We have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And what is one of the first things that Jeroboam does after the kingdom divides? He puts one less. What does he do? A golden calf right at the line, and a golden calf at Dan. And I see the golden calves, and I go, dun-dun-dun-dun. In 2015, we got to go to Israel with Everett Hufford, and one of the most sobering things was at Dan, they've excavated this whole area, and one of the features of it was that here was the location where the golden calf was. And I just couldn't hardly function, because I'm just thinking, this was just the source, and all these are the exteriors, but if you know what's going on the inside, then all these other things are taking place. 931, the northern kingdom's going to fall in 721, and out of the 19 kings, not one of them is good. Every one of them is involved in some type of idolatry and Baal worship. You go from 931 to 586, 87, Judah. You're going to have 20 kings. 6 are good some of the time, and of the 6, 3 of them are really worth their salt. So the majority of all the kings of Israel and even of Judah are involved in Baal worship. I want us to turn to the first page. Well, let me just do this while we're here. If you look at page 7 and 8, I'll just leave this for you to read. And these are samples. There's many others. But you just start looking at Baal, the master, the possessor, the one who quickens, the one who brings life, the one who guides the clouds and brings rain. And there's dozens of others. Then here is his sister / lover, girlfriend, sometimes called Asherah, Ashtaroth, Astarotheth. There's different terms. She's the female counterpart of that. And then here comes high places. See what we're talking about? And again, samples. This isn't the total. I just want to give you some samples. Then here are green trees. And see Deuteronomy 16. Do not plant a tree as an Asherah besides the altar of the Lord your God. Do not set up a pillar which the Lord your God hates. And when you know what these symbols of Baal and Asherah worship are, every time you hear high places, green trees, and pillars, then this whole system is involved, and the men especially are encouraged to be involved in sacred prostitution, especially through the winter into the spring, with the priestesses of Asherah and Baal to encourage her to do all the stuff that took place within the myth. When you turn the page, and again, this is, you just can't hardly read this. Isaiah 57 and 5. You who burn with lust among the oaks under every green tree, who slay your children in the valleys, under the clefts of the rocks. Here's Moloch, separate from Baal. And again, alert, this is just, gross doesn't even begin. It was this huge metal statue with the arms are kind of together like this, hollow. They would set a fire inside, and they would roll children down the arms, and they would asphyxiate as their skin was pulled off of them and as they died in order to appease the gods. So when you start talking about God, it's saying, I hate these things. And that's what I'm saying. You begin to see how carnal and how fleshly and how worldly. And friends, the world is worldly enough without doing this for worship. And when that comes into a nation as the system of worship, it just multiplies and goes downhill so fast. And then there's the description of pillars. So what I'd like for you to do now is go back to the very first page. And I'll have to leave parts of this for you to read and to look at. But notice this. What percentage of time are God's people idolaters? And I'm going to maintain the largest percentage of the time. I would never thought of this, but our religious teaching class, the guy said, at the burning bush, God begins an all-out war on idolatry. Moses, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. And it's going to take him 1,000 years to totally wean Israel off of idols. And they finally are going to have to go into captivity for 70 years. And the comment was, when they came back, they had many sins, but they've never been idolaters since. Joshua 24, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, they served other gods. Abraham's heritage and family is idolatry. I think a part of why he sends him to the promised land is to get him away from all the stuff that he had originally grown up with. Rachel stole the household gods. Jacob buried the gods there. And notice this, the gods are typically described in terms of geography, and this is a wonderful example, 2 Chronicles 28. Oh, they're the gods of the hills and not the gods of the valleys, and that's a whole different thing with the teaching that's there. Sorry, I missed the verse. Let's go back. 2 Chronicles 28:23, here is Ahaz, and he's in the northern kingdom, and here's the sound-alike. Sorry, I'm wrong. Ahaz is in the southern kingdom, but Ahaz is only one letter away from Ahab. And Ahab and Jezebel are in the northern kingdom, and he's the worst. And one of the worst in the southern kingdom is Ahaz. And this is just kind of hard to believe. His son's name is Hezekiah. Absolutely one of the best. But look at Ahaz. The gods of the Syrians help them. I will sacrifice to them. They were the ruin of him. He gathered the vessels of the house of God. He cut in pieces the vessels. He shut the doors of the house of the Lord. He made altars in every corner of Jerusalem. And here it comes. He made high places to make offerings to other gods. Did you hear it? Now, this is just what's just incomprehensible. When you nail the doors of the temple shut, what stops? Passover, Pentecost, Day of Atonement, Feast of Booths, and plus you take the vessels in the house of the Lord and you cut them up. Just the degradation and the ungodliness nearly just has no bottom on it once they get involved in all of those things. We're at the end. Here's Ezekiel. He sees this vision, and the elders are in the temple with engravings on the walls, every form of creeping things. This is 8:10. Beast, idols, and you'll see all of these things that are there. But look at the very bottom verse. Here's Jeremiah just before Jerusalem is destroyed. Your gods, plural, have become as many as your cities, and as many as the streets of Jerusalem's are the altars you have set up to shame, and altars to make offerings to Baal. They went far from me and went after worthlessness and became worthless. Let's turn the page. We're going to just very quickly highlight, and some of the verses are at the bottom, about Mount Carmel. But just think about this, and here we are in 1 Kings 18, and we'll describe this in a second. But I want this to just be a really clear picture in your mind. They build the altars, they have the bulls there, and from morning until noon, the prophets of Baal cry out to Baal and all this other stuff, and then Elijah starts mocking them. And get ready, what happens at a point in time? I'm glad we have some medical people here. I may need some help by the time I get through this. They pull out the swords and lances and gash themselves, and the blood starts coming spurting out of them. If blood is spurting out of people, what have they done? They've cut veins and arteries. Sunday morning people will know this. I'm probably 6 or 7. I'm crawling up a corner post with long barbs on it, and the post breaks. And as I slide down, the last thing I remember are things hanging out of my arms. My wife was the pre-med helper with Dawn Dunn. She knows every part of the body, every detail. We have been in hospital rooms, and when they start telling all the details and I start turning green, she just squeezes my arm and I quietly go out. and she gets the rest of the details. One of our wonderful older sisters at South Walker, Zoe, why don't you ride the bus? 85. Well, one, I don't like older people. And two, when those ladies get through with their organ recitals, I have trouble worshiping on Sunday. How desperate do you have to be to take something and start cutting yourself until the blood comes out? I mean, I want this just to be fixed in your, when I talk about fear, what a vivid picture. Oh, Baal, answer us. And what is it like? Oh, well, maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's on a journey. You can already hear the chant, louder, louder, maybe a little bit louder. This is, from inspiration, such a vivid picture of the primary emotion that's involved, because when you can't get through to the ultimate realm and your gods aren't listening to you, then you start doing desperate things. And you'll see other occasions, well, we're in real trouble, so bring my son here. We'll sacrifice my son on the wall. Do you see how degraded this is? So we're going to have sacred prostitution, there's worship of snakes, there's child sacrifice. The list just goes on. And once you get into the realm of many, many gods, fear is the ultimate emotion. Here's the contrast. Hallelujah, praise Jehovah, from the heavens praise his name. You can already hear it. What is it? It's joy. The same thing that Baal worshipers would look at the world around them and would do very bizarre things, then the worshipers of Yahweh are going to see the same world and say, no, he is outside. He created. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day to day they pour forth speech, and yet there is not a sound, and yet their voice is heard throughout the whole world. Oh, in them he has set a tent for the sun. And you go through all these wonderful passages, and the nature psalms of joy are a polemic, an argument against the degradation and the fear that gripped God's people when they're involved in idols and Baal worship. If you look, let's do this very quickly. Do you see under the line under fear and joy? Omri is Ahab's dad, and he is going to marry his son to the daughter of the Tyre and Sidons, because things would come in from the Mediterranean and would go up through Damascus. And this was a brilliant financial move. By this marriage alliance with this guy's daughter, then trade came through Samaria and brought wealth into Israel. The only problem was, guess who she was? Jezebel. What was a brilliant move financially was an absolute catastrophe spiritually, because into the royal house, which had already dabbled with this, then here comes a full-grown devotion to the worship of Baal. And notice, I'm in 1 Kings 18, verse 17, right in the middle. You have abandoned the commandments of the Lord, you have followed the Baals. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Now, who is Baal? The God who, again, Baal myth, is resurrected in the springtime, the God who rides the clouds, the God who brings rain, and the God who brings fertility. And guess what? It hasn't rained for 3 years. And what does Ahab say to the prophet Elijah when he sees him? You troubler of Israel. It's because of people like you that the Baal myth hasn't worked, and it can't be that Baal's wrong. And therefore, this witch hunt starts for anybody who's not worshiping Baal. And here's where the pressure for the sacred prostitution, all this other stuff would grow, because we're in a 3-year drought. Who has not been worshiping recently is the pull that's going to be going on. And then there it is. They called on the name of Baal from morning to evening. Maybe he's asleep. He's on a journey. They cried aloud. They cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as the midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering. No voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. When you turn the page, how calm is Elijah? Well, by the way, let's bring some water up here and douse this thing with water, just in case there's any doubt. And he quietly prays to the God of heaven, and God chooses to answer by fire and licks up the whole thing. And again, whole lessons on this. We're in the book of Revelation, and when we're talking about the teaching who are seducing my servants to practice immorality, you tolerate that woman, Jezebel. And even as Scripture closes, we hear these echoes of the depravity of this kind of worship. This is a really interesting part, and I'll leave you to read these, but when you look at 1 Kings 20:23, the Syrians were defeated. Oh, they are the gods of the hills, not the God of the valley. Next year we'll fight them in the valley. God's a regional God. Naaman the Syrian, once he's cured, he asked for loads of dirt to take with him, because this is where the God of Israel was, and he's not rebuked for doing this. What is Jonah doing? He rises to leave Israel to do what? To flee from the presence of God. And when the storm takes place, what are they crying out? Everybody cry to your gods. See the polytheism and the fear for the ultimate realm. We're about to be destroyed. Well, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the God of heaven who made the sea and the land. He knew he was fleeing from the presence of gods. And so all of these gods are regional or local. There's this competition, you're never quite sure. And listen, in contrast, after every day, Moses quietly says, you know, that was good. Oh, that was good. Instead of the many gods, and this is one of my favorite, and I think it's John Willis, the first time I saw this, I would never have seen this myself. What God forms on day 1, he's going to fill on day 4. What God forms on day 2, he's going to fill on day 5. Everybody see the chart? What God forms on day 3, he's going to fill on day 6. Do you see how orderly the creation account is? The God outside speaking these things into existence. And then you stop and think, spiritually, we are formed in Christ in the waters of baptism, so that through our spiritual walk we may be filled with the fullness of God as we mature and as we grow. And the very same physical principle of creation that Moses gives us from the beginning is also true of our spiritual birth and our spiritual growth in Christ. We are formed by faith in the waters of baptism to be filled, and fill in the blank, with the Spirit, filled with the fullness of Christ, conformed to the image of Christ. Okay, turn the page. Here are samples, and like I said, dozens of others. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. I regret we didn't have time to do Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? Here are some samples of the nature psalms. Like I said, Bereans, you can go back and read. But let's close with this, the polemic against Baal worship in the nature psalms. And here it is. Remember, in the springtime, she has the banquet, the foreign gods are killed, Baal is freed, and therefore here comes the clouds, the lightning, the rain, the springtime, the fertility. Listen carefully. Isaiah 19, behold, Yahweh is riding on a swift cloud, and he comes to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt tremble at his presence. Psalm 68, 32, 33. O kingdoms of the earth, sing to God, sing praises to the Lord, to him who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens, and behold, he sends out his voice, his mighty voice. Psalm 104, verse 3. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot, and he rides on the wings of the wind. Why are inspired writers talking about Yahweh, the Lord, riding on the clouds of the wind? This is one of the core teachings in Baal worship. And that which they looked at with a sense of fear, then the Hebrew is going to look at with a sense of joy. And you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes in the summertime, we have those huge, huge billowing clouds, and these echoes of these verses come to mind. I know it's a metaphor. I know it's a poetic description. But when you understand the core teaching of Baal worship, the one who quickens, the one who brings rain, the one who brings thunder and lightning, how many theophanies, examples of God, as in Mount Sinai, is there thunder and lightning and earthquakes in contrast? Psalm 65, 8 and 9. You who dwell on the end of the earth, and this is God, he makes the going out of the morning and the evening to shout for joy. Can I say sunrise, sunset? There are times that I actually go fishing up here on the edge of Lake Hefner, and I am looking for a suicidal fish to drown a couple of worms. But I also want to watch the sun go down. And I hear the psalmist say, you make the coming of the morning and the evening to, and see, instead of fear, to shout for joy. You water the earth, the wilderness overflows, the hills gird themselves with joy, the meadows clothe themselves, the flocks, they deck themselves. They shout and sing together for joy. Psalm 61:1, shout for joy to God, all the earth. Psalm 96, I love these. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it, and the trees of the forest sing together for joy. Psalm 98, let the sea roar and all that fills it, and the world and those who dwell in it, and let the rivers clap their hands, and let the hills sing together for joy together. So a couple of things as we leave, and thank you for your patience. When you read through the book of Psalms, and it's in Isaiah, it's in Job, and all these other things, when you read biblical descriptions about the heavens rejoicing and all these other things, the joy that is the picture of the believer in God is in stark contrast to the fear that was the predominant both emotion and experience of God's people every time they went into idolatry. And so these are not just kind of passing passages about, and as my friend said, God doesn't live in trees. And I'm thinking, that's so true. But you don't understand. The people who read this for the first time were in a life and death struggle for faith. And their fear is always contrasted by the joy of God's creation. Last verse. And I've done this a time before, but still think about this. The last verse in the book of Psalms says, "Let everything that breathes praise the Lord." You don't have to go camping. If you just listen, wherever you are, in any part of the country, in any part of the world, God has a symphony. And I've mentioned we had a family of mockingbirds at Eastside. And a lot of mornings I would pull up to the building and roll down my window and hear ta-da, 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 ta-da. And I thought, buddy, you are setting a high bar. Wouldn't it be embarrassing if a redeemed, ransomed child of God was being outdone in giving praise to God by a little bird? Let everything that breathes praise the Lord. And may that apply especially to you and I.